So, what happens if we are at a point that is not our equilibrium, or that we're not at a point wherever the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied? I want to talk about the two different cases where that might happen. So, first and foremost, let's just assume that maybe in our market, the price of gasoline is being set at $1.75. Now, from our previous video, we know that $1.75 is actually cheaper than what our equilibrium price is. If you guys notice, that $1.75 is down here. But what I want us to do is pay very careful attention to what's going on here. If you notice, if we draw a line straight over from $1.75, we hit that red line, right? Our supply curve, we hit it at 20 million gallons. And that's because at a price so cheap, there's not a lot of gas that's willing and able to be provided by the suppliers or the producers. However, at a cheaper price of gasoline, we see the amount demanded is a lot higher. 60 million gallons of gas is being demanded. So if we look over on our supply and demand schedule off to the left, we can see at $1.75, 60 million gallons of gas is being demanded and 20 million gallons of gas is being supplied. Well, so what does that mean? Well, what that means is we don't have enough gas available in our economy for everybody that wants gas. What do we call this? Well, we call this a shortage. A shortage is just any time that we see that more of a product is being demanded than is being supplied at a specific price. So for example, at $1.75, more people want to buy gas when it's that cheap than suppliers are going to be made available. So there's a shortage of gasoline. Anytime we see a price that is below our equilibrium price, we're going to have a shortage. And that's because our demand curve, as you guys can see, that blue line sits further to the right than our supply curve. And the cheaper and cheaper it gets, we see the size of that shortage gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so anytime we see that our quantity demanded is greater than our quantity supplied, we call that a shortage. And you guys can see that on our schedule as well. At a price of $2, there's a shortage. At a price of $1.50, there's a shortage. Because at both of those points too, we see that the amount that's being demanded is greater than the amount being supplied. And so that gap that exists between our supply and our demand curve is called a shortage. So here's what I want to ask you. What is the size of our shortage? Like when we say that 60 million gallons of gas is being demanded, 20 million is being supplied, how much gas are we short by? Well, we can just do some simple math. We can say, okay, well, we want 60 million gallons, but we only have 20 million available. That means we have a shortage of 40 million gallons of gas. When gas is that cheap, we just don't have enough. Now, how does the market respond whenever our price is that low? Well, as you guys probably know, whenever businesses see that, they say, oh man, people want to buy gas. We need to raise our prices. And so the price of gas will start rising, rising, rising until we get to our equilibrium where the market clears. Because businesses realize at a price that's this low, they could make more money if they chose to raise their price. But what happens if there's a case wherever maybe the businesses don't have the option of raising their price? We see that sometimes the government does intervene and they can set restrictions in the market in order to prevent the price from changing. So I want to use an example from Uber. And if you guys want to look into this a little bit more, I posted an article on Canvas as well about from a couple years ago about Uber in India, actually. And so what we had seen in India is that there was this time, and it was really the time typically is like later at night whenever surge pricing took place. And you guys actually saw that in your podcast response as well. Whenever this surge pricing was taking place, wherever the price of Ubers was so much more expensive. Now, why is that problematic? Well, because what we are starting to see is that people would come out after a night of drinking and they would check Uber, and because so many people needed an Uber, the price of Ubers was rising, rising, rising. And as we know, as prices go up, the quantity demanded goes down because some people were looking at that and say, you know what? That's way too much that's too much money for me. I don't want to take an Uber for that expensive. And we saw an increase in, people driving drunk. And the government didn't want that. And so what the government did is they stepped in and they set something known as a price ceiling. A price ceiling, just like a ceiling maybe in the room you're in right now, that ceiling is a maximum, right? So it's a maximum price set within the market. So say hypothetically, during this surge period, the average price of a ride, was $25. Let's say that on average that was the price of the ride. It was our equilibrium, and there was 1,000 rides being supplied and demanded in the evening at that price. Well, what the government did is they said, listen, listen, listen. We're seeing that, people are, when it's that high, we understand that's the equilibrium, but that's still too high for some people. So that's a problem. We don't want people to go out and drive drunk. So we're going to set a restriction, and say hypothetically they set it at like $15. So they set a restriction at $15 and say, we know that $25 is the equilibrium, but we're not letting you charge more than $15. Well, what kind of impact is that going to have on our supply and our demand? Well, if you notice, the quantity demanded is going to increase because now that it's cheaper, more people want to take Ubers. But at the same time, when it's cheaper, we see fewer drivers are willing to go out and drive because they're not making as much money as they were before. They loved that surge pricing. And so what we end up seeing is that this price ceiling is preventing the price from rising to that equilibrium price. But the problem is it creates shortages, right? It's creating a shortage because if you notice, once we move our price down from our equilibrium price to that price ceiling, we see that there's a gap that opens up, right? The gap between the amount being demanded and the amount being supplied. And that's the problem that the government ended up running into after they set this price ceiling, is it created a shortage. However, effective price ceilings do create shortages because they set the price below our equilibrium. Now, hear me right now. This seems backwards from what we would think. We would think a price ceiling would be set above our equilibrium, right? Because it makes sense. A ceiling is like the top of the room, so we assume that the ceiling would go well above the equilibrium. But because our price ceiling is a maximum and it's preventing us from going to our equilibrium, in order for it to be effective, it has to fall below our equilibrium price, right? Because it, like a ceiling in your room keeps you from going up and out of the room, this ceiling keeps us from going up to our equilibrium. If the government said, hey, the maximum you can charge is $100 and it's way above our equilibrium price, well, that's not going to do anything because no one's charging $100. So in order for it to be effective, it has to fall below the equilibrium price.